All right. Okay. So user experience. So the idea behind user experience is that all too often we write and create software that it's hard to use, right? And we have a historic track record of implementing software for ourselves, as if we were using it, right? And it's oftentimes the case that we are not a very good representative of the real person who's going to be using this. And often, I mean, even as cool as it looks, and as geeky you feel that we've been, and somebody's going to appreciate our geekiness. Oftentimes, most folks are not, don't have the the bandwidth or throughput to be able to consume lots and lots of data. And oftentimes, products that are perfectly fine and they do what they're supposed to be doing, they're just returned. A lot of products just come back, even though they're perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just folks weren't able to figure it out on how to use it, right? Or they're calling a call center for help. How do I do this? How do I do that? And that turns out to be very, very expensive, right? That folks creating a ticket that are going to have somebody on the phone talking to somebody. That's just way, way too expensive. So what user experience tries to do is come to a realization that you're either going to spend the time and effort up front, or you're going to spend it even more expensive later on at a later date, right? So what is it that can we do now, right? That can guarantee a better success rate out the door when it goes out, right? Realizing that developers have somewhat of an attitude, to blame the user, right? That it's perfectly fine. It's just the user. They don't know how to do this, that, or the other, right? So we need to change a little bit of that attitude and realize that we certainly can do a better job at creating a user experience. So definitely UX or user experience matters. There's a lot of money and success at stake, and we want to see what can we do to improve it. So there's always an interface. Anything you touch, it's meant to be used by a human, right? Handrails, the way you sit, where the particular height from the floor, and the table, the height from the table, the size of the door, the doorknob, anything you touch, right, is meant to be handled by a human being. Somebody thought of this, right, on how is it going to feel when you touch it, when you interact with it, and what's going to be your experience? Is it going to be a pleasurable experience? Obviously, we in the software world, we're talking about software user experience, right, and certainly has evolved over time. Most folks would say that you would have to ask folks what they want. What would there be? What would it look like if they had a choice? Some companies just don't care. They don't ask anyone. They just go on and do their best, and it turns out to be that's exactly what we wanted. We didn't know we needed an iPhone until somebody showed it to us, right? When Steve Jobs just flicked that screen and started scrolling, right? It says, duh, obviously, right? How else would you scroll through a long list, right? I remember when I saw HCI back in college, one of the students proposed, this was many decades ago, and one of the students proposed a direct manipulation of this scrolling through a long list, and everybody laughed at her and saying, no, that would be, how would you actually implement that? That was just, if you would just get tired of scrolling through this, right? I said, well, no, it's gravity. It has an inertia, right? You flick it, and it just scrolls indefinitely. So that was brilliant. So everything is an interface, right? A car for us is just a couple of dials, a steering wheel, some pedals, a stick shift, right? Soon all those will go away. right? The cars will drive itself, so none of that will be there either. But that's what we interact with. Eventually, it'll be just voice, or at some point the car will know just by just knowing what we need. I wonder if that same. It looks like more and more our life is becoming this world of where you're free to do anything as long as it's within certain boundaries, right? That the car won't actually let you crash onto another car, right? It's like going in the on a park with all these cars that are in a particular lane and you can't move away. Perhaps our lives will become more and more like that as AI takes over our life and puts those boundaries. Anyway, so everything has an interface, knobs and dials, and presumably some human is going to touch this. And some very iconic interfaces that were very popular in the 80s. And we can go back and decide whether it's a good design. Here's another one, that might be somewhat that's contradictory, perhaps, depending on the context of how you interpret it. Right, garbage only, no trash, or something that we might not know what things refer to what. Whether that arrows are referring to the left-hand side or the top side, right? That are inconsistent. You don't know how to interpret them. Or some are just very pleasing, that provide some level of abstraction, right? That remove tons of the details, the minutia that are not needed, when you want to think of it something in a conceptual model, right? So this is a very high level abstraction of a conceptual model of how the map of Boston is laid out, right? Certainly. Makes a lot of simplifications, but it fits in with our sense of place and how we think about the city, and that's the hard part, right? That the user will have a mental model of their expectations of how something works, right, and the actual model of how something works, right? And what good design tries to do is to make those match. Right, that you do have the right mental model of how something works, and it maps reality, right? And not that it's so hard to figure out that you press it one way and it does something. You press it exactly the same way and it does something else. Right? So you're trying to predict. The user starts to trying to predict, why did this happen? Was it a time delay? Was it that I double clicked it? What did I do different than before, right? And even though we as developers, we would like to give more power to users. Oftentimes, it's a detriment to the user, right? We've given multiple ways of doing things, right? The user starts to be concerned of how when will it be that the body of knowledge will be complete for me to fully understand this. I get there's like 2, 3, 4 different ways that you can. You either create a branch or merge it or switch, or it just gives you a plethora of ways of doing the same exact thing, right? Which is great for power users, but for somebody who's using it from time to time, it's just bewildering, right? Of why what's different if I do it this way or that other way, right? But for geeks, that's great. So anyway, so the idea of user experience is that. We want to force ourselves to look at the world from the eyes of the user, right? We're going to be centering the user at the center of the universe, and see from their point of view, and provide perhaps certain prototypes early on for them to play around with, and let them fail or succeed, right? And do some statistical analysis at data that we're going to capture as users go through various versions of our user interface, right? And we'll see what the delays are, where do they get stuck, where they might need help, and we want to catch these things early on, and spend our money and invest this early on as opposed to investing it later with call centers and tickets and things that are returned. Okay. So there's several perspectives or aspects that we like to look at things on how the system is organized, the types of interaction, the accessibility, functionality, and just to make sure that the mental model, user's mental model, matches the reality, right? And that we're producing something that gives value to the user. So human-computer interaction, the research focuses on what are the strategies, perspectives, what are the things, what are the knobs that we can switch and move around that are and what things can we measure out of this, and what types of experiments can we do that would yield us any information that would inform us on how to generate a better user interface. What the user sees is a user interface, right? Just lots of rectangles and with different colors and fonts and laid out in a particular structure, but it has to be consistent across multiple screens, right? That has to have a particular vocabulary of how things are laid out that makes it predictable, that gives the user some context, that forces that helps the user be focused on their particular task. So user interface provides definitely the look and feel, but also the interaction and the accessibility to the data set. And at the end of the day, they are manipulating a data set, right? That's what they're doing. Right? We're providing this abstraction where underneath they're actually manipulating some data set, right? And we're providing these beautiful knobs that is really just changing some number or some string in some class, right? Yeah. So why are we doing this? It definitely matters. These are some statistics on the amount of money or number of tickets and the number of minutes of in a call center, folks calling in and staying on for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, at a pay rate of how much it costs per ticket, and the number of tickets that were average statistics of how much does one ticket cost, right? And it's just billions and billions of dollars are being wasted on these call centers. Folks returning pieces of software or pieces of products that were working perfectly fine, and there's a lot of history on products that were promising, and somebody came along and just by changing the user interface, no change in technology really, no major breakthrough in any of the technology stack, but just the wrapping, just the way you wrap it and you sell it and you market it. The Rio seemed to be very promising, and they were already on. I think they made a good first assumption of using or designing something on top of something that was already familiar. Right, everybody was familiar with a Walkman. This just was a digital version of a Walkman, and it really was doing very well up until somebody else stepped in, and just by packaging the user interface and making it more intuitive and addressing a little better what users were expecting to do, how to consume their music, right? Perhaps they studied the behaviors of folks, the way they consume large amounts of media, right? That it made more sense to just create these long lists and playlists of instead of consuming individual songs. Users were tending to consume, large collections of playlists that were related to one another. And soon after, it took off. Folks just flocked to the Apple iPod, and the rest is history. And here's a famous quote from Steve Jobs that many folks think of user interface or user experience as separate from the product design, right? That somehow there's this amorphous, gray box that is the product, and then somebody comes along and just puts a paint makes it look pretty, right? And so where their philosophy was that no, it's not separate. You don't think of a product and then make it pretty, but it's part of the entire user experience, right? That there's an entire ecosystem, right, of how each one of these products then fits into a larger, there's a strategic vision to the entire data set of their products, right? And designing is not easy, right? What might seem very trivial to you, and from your points of view of your particular biases, from your particular culture, right, might not be completely obvious to a completely different culture, right? Things that you might take as an analogy, some people might take it as literal, right? So certainly that's important, and also we oftentimes just want to jam as much functionality into one of them, and we think we're adding value to it, right? And it turns out that most of what we're going to be providing, only 5% of what we're providing is actually going to be used by 80% of the folks, right? But we could have spent much more effort at that 5% and making it even more polished, right? This is something that happens over and over and over. Millions of dollars are spent on features that no one's ever going to use, right? And this little feature over there that we weren't thinking too much of it turns out to be the killer feature that most folks are using it for, right? Certainly Facebook and YouTube. There's a plethora of history of products that started that way, right? That were supposed to be used one way. It turned out that users completely use it. So we have to listen to what the users are want, right? We want to involve them in that decision. So what is good design? Certainly want to give the users what they need, what they want, that it's natural for them, that it fits naturally into their work process. Help them to not paint themselves into a corner, and give them support whenever they need it automatically in the application. And it's easy to say, but it's certainly not easy to actually implement. So user-centered design it all starts with putting the user in the center, right? And then designing everything around that user. That's kind of what a lot of car manufacturers say, right? We started with the user sitting, right, and then we designed the cockpit around it, right? So be able to reach and ergonomics and what would they want from that product. So one of the challenges here is that every user is different, right? There's no way that we could possibly design something that is optimized for everybody, right? We have to make compromises, right? And hopefully the compromises that we choose will be the right ones, right? And so that's the trick. What are the compromises that we're going to make? There's no way to please everybody. How can we design the 20 where we can where 20% of our effort can perhaps address 80% of the problems, right? And what are those 80%? That's what we want to be able to find out, right? We have to consider our demographics and what are the technical expertise that they might have, what capabilities they might have, what cultural expectations, what languages, their particular style, sense of style. Also, their different capabilities of visual and audio perception. They're willing to learn on their own and just throw away the manual and just just hack at it and learn it on their own. What kind of memory and attention span they might have. And the challenge is that just no one person represents everybody, right? We have to kind of decide what subset of the population are we going to go with, right? Some folks might be colorblind, and all these clues that we were thinking about using color scheme for giving to giving context of where you were in a particular part of the application kind of go out the door since some of the population doesn't see colors, right? So is it okay that 10% of folks are not going to be benefited for your color scheme? Is it okay? Is that a trade-off that you're willing to make? Perhaps, right? Or can you give other clues
for addressing some of their needs, right? And oftentimes, we make the decision that we want to create that something that is going to please everybody. Multiple sizes, and if you flick this switch, you'll be a power user. If you flick this other switch, you'll be a beginner. If you flick all these other switches, so we want to please everybody. So there's no way we're going to do that, right? And some companies, they take pride at making these of making these compromises. Apple for quite a while made these compromises that they were they were addressing a population, and some folks felt that I'm a power user. Why don't you give me access to the power things, right? Oftentimes the iPhone and the iPad oftentimes were considered to be, why don't you give me access to the actual file system? That's not the audience they were trying to address, right? So they made a lot of compromises with perhaps some forward thinking on how is that we're going to eventually bring together many operating systems and make them consistent, as opposed to perhaps the way Microsoft went and says, yes, we'll give you everything, right? But then it's not the best experience as a pad or as a tablet. It's not a great experience as an operating system, right? So what are the compromises that you're willing to do? Not be good at any of the two, or perhaps focus on being the best at one of them. But I think it was a good move forward. So how can we make this predictable? What can we do to measure whether a particular user experience is going to be successful or not? So some of the techniques that work well for software development not necessarily are applicable for user experience, right? So in perhaps in a waterfall or in a more agile, you might have several releases that might give you some feedback, and this doesn't really work well with user experience. Typically, you would accept that there was some feedback from the field users using the application, and ideally, you would iterate over the user experience, right? But this is actually traditional waterfall doesn't work well since you would be expecting that some end user, right, would be using a user interface that is not yet mature, right? And presumably they're going to run into issues, and then they're going to give you feedback on it, right? And then you want to iterate over that, right? So typically, the end user is not going to have the patience or the willingness to be the guinea pig here to where you go. Is going to give you some feedback, right, or give you some structured feedback that might be useful, right? Typically, they'll just say, "Oh, this is crap. I'm not going to buy this," or perhaps going to try and convince others not to buy your product, right? So since I had such a bad user experience, right? So it's not mature. So using waterfall or any technique that would rely on an end user to participate in the evolution of the user experience, it's very costly, right? Ideally, you want to have identified these issues much earlier, right? Much before getting up to the end user. So again, same thing. An iterative design, any of these techniques that work well for software development, not necessarily work well with user experience, right? You want this much earlier. It's too late by the time it gets to the end user, right? So you need to do this as early as possible, perhaps using techniques that are not as expensive, perhaps using some prototyping tools, some just paper prototypes that can give you some early ideas of perhaps some things that should not even be explored, right? Some radical ideas that no one is accepting. So ideally, you want to try to identify users that represent the end user, that can be stand in place of those users, or that it can be representative of end users with the same demographics, the same technical savviness, and try to identify what they want to accomplish, and then try to bring them together. Right? What is it that can we iterate over that early on? Right? Finding these folks, giving them something to try out, and just iterate over that early on before we even start coding or putting any code in place. We need to create kind of like a matrix of all the different types of folks that we want to address, the audience that we want to address, their ages, their skill level, whether they're novice, knowledgeable, or frequent users, whether they have certain mental, physical abilities, whether they're domain experts, whether they know any previous knowledge of the particular domain that we're trying to solve. What kind of environment they're going to be working, communication with partners, and we would create a matrix of these users, right, and all the capabilities, right, so that it would inform us and give us some context on what type of users we're talking about. For each one of them, we want to be able to answer, whether they're novices or experts, what is it that they want to accomplish, how often they've been using the system, and what are their goals that they want to achieve. Now the best technique typically is that to get some ideas is that there'll be some brainstorming set of sessions where everybody goes in and just in an unstructured environment, folks just throw out lots of ideas. Nobody criticizes anybody's idea. There will be a moderator so that things don't go into chaos. That would be capturing some of these ideas for the user interface. And ideally, there will be somebody there with somebody prototyping some of these ideas, right? And immediately, showing up to the stakeholders and say, "Hey, how about this? How about that?" So this first initial ideas would go on to some user experience labs and verify their validity with real users. Typically, these brainstorming sessions would be followed on with some interviews where you would break out with smaller teams and have perhaps one-on-one or smaller teams that are focused on a particular issue, and some or in addition also following around or real users, right? Where you would be observing them and following them around and filling out some forms, and oftentimes they might feel awkward that you're following them around, and then sometimes they might feel threatened or feel threatened for their jobs. It's your responsibility to allay them and make sure that you're okay. I'm just trying to find out what you're doing, and trying to see what forms you're filling out, what reports are you reading. What is the information that you have to find to be able to respond to these forms, and then you have these interviews where you try to elicit some of these requirements. Then you plan how is it that you're going to validate a particular user interface. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So you're going to validate a user interface where you're going to show these mock-ups of these wireframes to real users, and they're going to start touching it and dragging it and moving it around, and you're going to be recording their movements, right? Their movements with their hands. What are they looking at? And you're going to ask them to speak aloud, right? Of what are they thinking about, and you're going to start recording these. How long did it take you to click this and find this and search and scroll and all this is going to be tabulated and data mined to see what problems did they find, right? You give them specific tasks to do, right? And you identify the different tasks and goals, identifying the use cases in the brainstorming and in the interviews, and then you measure. A lot of their interaction with the user experience, right? And taking lots and lots of notes, and if they get stuck, they get stuck. You're not going to help them, right? Because the idea is that no one's going to be there to help them, right? And that's just going to be a data point for you, right? Of where to identify problems, or potential problems. Obviously, treat your participants with respects. That they're testing the side. You're testing the side, not the user. So it's you don't lose patience with the user if they get stuck. It's not their fault, right? It's always the fault of the user interface. So don't jump to any conclusions. And perhaps how much is it that you're going to give them as a prior knowledge, right, of what the task is about, right, and what clues you might give them to achieve. Because it might be the very first time that they're using this, right, and they might not be representative of the user that you want. So what do we provide them? Ideally, you would provide them with you could start with paper prototypes, right? So these are some of the designs that were used for the Blackberries and the Nintendo. These paper user interfaces have proven to be fairly useful, right? That you can whip one up really quick just by using these tools, these rapid prototyping tools, where you can drag and drop lots of widgets, right? Just print them, and it's a very easy way, very inexpensive way that you can have a first data points on where to go, where not to go. You might have a plethora of options, right? And this would allow you to very quickly just drop some of the first initial ideas, right? And just focus on a subset of ideas that you want to explore, with perhaps a more involved, more real prototypes, right? It could be just a whiteboard. Or something just scribbled on a piece of paper, or it could be something that is bigger, or some tabs and just paper prototype. And they have proven to be very, very useful, right? Oftentimes there's we think that if we do it in HTML, or if we do it in some more advanced technology, we might have a better. And that's not the case. It turns out that paper prototypes seem to be as accurate as more advanced, or at least very, very early on. It could be something that is bigger. It doesn't have to be 8.5 by 11. But certainly there's tons and tons of tools out there that allow you to quickly just drag and drop multiple things that you can print out very quickly. They're fast, right? There's no need for coding. Very, very quickly to find early problems, and gives you some feedback before any implementation starts, right? Any real money, any real investment starts, right? Yes, it's great. You don't need to code, but at the end, you don't have any code, right? That's good and bad. Not always is representative, right? It's ideally you would have a wide sample of folks that are in different spectrum of multiple variables that you want to measure, so that so that your sampling is not going to bias you towards making the wrong decisions. So there's several principles that in user interface that Jacob Nielsen, it's a famous UI research that came up with this set of principles that you should always take into account when you are designing a user interface. One of them is that you should use clues that folks might be already familiar with, right? And perhaps create analogies of something that they're familiar with. They're familiar with a chair, they're familiar with a table, they're familiar with a building, in the space that they inhabit. Right. So what clues can we borrow from reality, right, that we can represent and make an analogy that folks could identify, right? So one that seems to have been fairly valuable is the use of a desktop, right? Once we explain them what a desktop is, and that there's folders, and folders can contain documents. So that's an analogy from the real world that folks were able to map their reality onto this this analogy, and and it worked very, very well when Xerox first looked at it, and then Apple kind of stole that idea and went and then made it accessible to everybody else, and then Windows again, right? And it became the de facto way that we think about the user interfaces, right? Even though obviously there are no real folders, there's no real desktop, there's no real anything, right? At the end of the day, it's just a whole bunch of documents, right? But this abstraction layer, kind of let us think about it in a natural way that we can identify, right? Now the problem with analogies is that we could take that analogy too far, right? That where the analogy starts to break, right? That it no longer maps to real life, or that analogies change. Things that were in the culture at some point are no longer in the culture, right? We used to think of the icon of a floppy disk, meaning that you're saving something. I don't know that anybody here has ever seen a floppy disk, and that no longer the analogy fits, right? Or that we use folders anymore, right? Or that it uses any paper anymore. So things like clipboards and paper products, they're starting to kind of lose their meaning, right? As part of an analogy, everything turns out to be that it's just something rectangular, right? That's all we have, right? That's just this rectangular thing, right? But it doesn't map to anything physical, right? And when this will be eventually live in our brains, and there will be no need for an interface, then I don't know what analogy will be, right? What analogy will we use? So the analogies over time they lose their meaning. Many of the newer interfaces are starting to lose and get rid of these analogies, right? Of using maybe a clock with a minute and a second, right? So I don't know that anybody uses an analogous clock anymore, right? Or it's kind of everybody uses their phone to see what the time is. Oh wait. So analogy. So you've seen a lot of the evolution of interfaces today, where everything's just a square, right? That no longer. For instance, iPhones used to be really, really heavy on trying to force a particular mapping to the real world, right? So notes had these pencils and these spirals and things like a bounded book that looked like it was leather. So it's trying to force us to map the real world, right? And we're starting to move away from these analogies. And again, we don't know where this is going to take us, right? It looks like everything is just going to be just one big square. So the metaphors are losing their interest. So physical representations of files, folders, and scroll bars to scroll through multiple things that are very, very long. And again, we're trying to bring in affordances, right? That we can map to the real world. That chairs are for sitting. Knobs are for turning, buttons for pushing, right? So these analogies are still valid, are still, but slowly they will be losing their interest. Some other natural mappings. Certainly, we would like to be able to make sure that if we lay out certain aspects of the interface, that we're not overloading the user having to calculate and reason what is the meaning of this, right? So if you have 4 knobs across the horizontal, right, it is not clear which knob maps to which burner, right? I still have to look and read in my burner at my house. I have to read. It's a left rear, right? And I'm concerned because it's kind of fading, right? And I don't know which it is, right? So I'm gonna have to eventually I'm either gonna have to paint it again or turn it to see which one turns on and do it by trial and error. Where with somebody might design in such a way that there is no overload, that I have to think about it, right? It maps naturally. Direct manipulation, ideally would be direct manipulation. Today, some inductive ovens, right? You can touch the You can touch the burner, right? It doesn't go. It's not hot at all, right? Because it uses some induction magnetic fields, right? So you can change it and move its temperature directly, right? Direct manipulation. Same idea with the way MapQuest dealt with manipulating maps and the way. And you remember what MapQuest, right? This was the precursor to Google Maps, right? That had this indirect manipulation of a map. You could still scroll left and right and up and down and zoom in and zoom out. So all the affordances were there, all the use cases were there, but it used a indirect manipulation of the data. Whereas Google Maps, went with a direct manipulation. You grab the map, right? And you can jiggle it around and move it and flick it, right? And give this inertia, right? Where you would fill in the blanks. And this was I was blown away the very first time I used Google Maps. After having used MapQuest for so long, it says, wow, so direct manipulation definitely is kind of the better way to go. That there's an immediate response, right? That I touch something and I see a response immediately. That I can make a mental relationship with what I'm doing and the way it responds immediately, right? That there's no lag, that or there's no jerking, there's no continuity, there's no break in the continuity of the behavior, right? So for instance, if I scroll and I hit the scroll and all of a sudden just the page entirely refreshes, right? I don't see a continuous movement of the scroll bar, right? It kind of is asking me to make the interpolation, the extrapolation between the movement of something physical and the actual indirect movement of that data. Drag and drop and scroll bars and visual. We want immediate feedback so that we can mentally, and I think Microsoft has done a lot of this, right? In their new version of Word and Excel, they have animations everywhere, right? Even when you move a cell from left to right, everything's continuous, and you can see how everything moves very, very smoothly, which I think it's a very, very good move forward. Another one is consistency and standards. There's a common thread, there's a common vocabulary of the ways that things are laid out, the ways, the color scheme that you choose, that the user can see that is consistent. That I can expect headers to be at the top. I can expect my tools to be at the top. I can expect secondary tools that I don't use often to be on the right. Right? I can expect this vocabulary that I can, as I move from one place in the application to the other, that I don't have to relearn a new vocabulary of colors and the language, the visual language that you're using. So certainly this increases the usability. That we do give them that inevitably folks are going to paint themselves into a corner, that they're gonna find a place where they don't know how to continue. That we give them contextual help, right? That there is a document there that depending on where they are, they might have the needed help that they need when they need it, depending on the particular context. That they have a means for somehow going back to a previous step that were stable for them, right? Where was I? How did I get here? Right? That there's a way to either cancel what you were trying to do, or go back to a previous state that you knew where you were safe, right? That you can give them different state that you can jump from and go back to and undo what you were doing, or if it's something that is taking longer than you were expected, that you can just pause it or just cancel it, right, and go back to a previous known state, right? That you know what the system is doing, right? If it's taking too long, that gives me a progress bar. That gives me a real progress bar, right? That it's not fakely, just going all the way to 80% and just stops, right? And then the next 20% is just a couple hours later, right? So it really gives me an idea of how long I'm going to be here, right? And that it gives me confidence that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that it gives them some status of what I think it's doing. I was reading an article about all these interfaces in cockpits, in airplane cockpits, right? Certainly there's folks go through a lot of training to understand all the workings of these and one of the things that we've tried to do to help the pilots is that we try to automate systems, right? That to help them, because either they have long flights and we can automate most of the activities that they do, and we've reached a point where we've automated so many things that pilots are becoming somewhat lazy, that they don't really have to do anything for most of the time, right? Just maybe landed and just up and down. That's all they need to do, right? And they're kind of becoming they're losing some of their training, and they're sometimes they're overconfident on what the automated system can do. Right, they've built this model around what they think what the system can do. That there might be some obvious things, like somehow the plane just keeps going and it's going to stall, and you say, well, wouldn't it be obvious that it would stop doing that, right? And it's not actually part of the system. The plane is clearly telling you, I'm stalling. You should take control now, right? And so there's we've reached a point where it's not the pilot's not clear of what is the responsibilities and what we assume systems that are automated systems can actually do, or that they're losing some of the skills that they would otherwise be familiar with if they would actually be responsible for flying it. So it's a big topic on either automating the whole thing or removing the automation, right? It's very, very concerning of some flights that have crashed, and looking at the black box, it was obvious that what the pilot could have done, just pushing the lever down and whatnot. And you hear them talking to each other and arguing what the plane is doing. Very scary. Visibility of what is the system doing. I guess stall is not enough. Stall. Anyway, so flexibility and efficiency, where we might try to identify that certain that perhaps we might have designed it to be easy for first-time users, right, or novices, and we might have broken down the task into multiple smaller tasks, right? But over time, as folks learn and understand how the system works, perhaps they're not novices anymore, and they kind of start getting tired of having to go through all these very small steps, and so we might provide them with alternative mechanisms that would automate some of these tediousness of this, right? So we might provide ways to save a query so they can quickly run it again, so they don't have to retype it again or recreate it again. So we might have created this very sophisticated way of creating the query, but maybe we can save it, and the next time it could be a shortcut that you can maybe click on it and automate some of these tools. So certainly be able to be flexible and increase the efficiency over time, and also provide a means for that. There's a visual clue of telling us where are we, what context are we, right? And depending on that context, there's certain behaviors that are associated to that context that I don't have to remember what the mode that I'm in, and depending on that mode, I have to behave behave in a different way, right? So there's a lot of modality errors, right? That depending on different modes, the system behaves in different ways. So that would create some cognitive load on the user, having to remember, right, what context that they're in. Error prevention, ideally, we would write it. Well, obviously, give them all support when they run into an error, but ideally, we would write it in such a way that we minimize possibilities for them to run into the errors in the first place, right? So we would decide to, instead of using input fields, text fields, we would perhaps provide a drop-down, right? That if we were asking for a time or date and whatnot, we would provide a date picker, right? Instead of having them to type an actual date, right? It could be very easy to mistype a date, right? So instead, we provide the right abstraction user interface for them to avoid typing errors. Also provide them with helpful messages that are not cryptic or are referring to some table, some primary key, foreign key, something in the back end, or some stack error. Instead of providing them with something that is consumable by a human being and that they can actually do something about it. And finally, just a sense of aesthetic that is pleasing, is minimalistic. And we're tending towards that, right? Everything is minimalistic, and I don't know that we can be as minimal as Google, just giving an input field. I don't know if anybody knew at the beginning what should I type in here, the very first time you ever used a search engine. But nevertheless, Google being the default that it is, and part of our culture, we know what it is for, right? But if you're not Google yet, perhaps you might want to put in there what is it that you're expecting me to type in there. But certainly not what Yahoo, right? Just bombarding everybody with it's kind of like throw the spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. Testing the UI, certainly you provide the user interface to real users that are going to go through it and do notes and measurements for us to measure and come back and know more about the behavior, and certainly not have the attitude of blaming the stupid user, right, for anything that they might not be doing right. You're just too stupid to use it, right? I oftentimes use my wife. She's the perfect user. She breaks everything, right? The other day I was I gave her my phone, and she was taking a picture, and when she would when she would hold the phone, the camera would just start deforming the camera, and then she would give it back to me, and it would be perfect. So what the? I would give the phone to her again, and she would hold it, and again it was just get all these lines, and she'd give it back to me, and it would be perfect. What the heck? So it was her. Clearly, it was her, right? It was obvious. Right? My task would prove that it was her, right? Until I realized that when she would hold the camera, she would hold it horizontally, but when I would hold it, I would hold it vertically, right? And after having had a huge fight over this, right? I finally just held it horizontally. I realized that the camera was bad, right? I was just holding it wrong, right? So again, right? So it was very, very easy, right? That your particular test is not evidencing what's wrong with the interface or the apparatus or the device. So just and your biases of what you might think about your loved one, it might bias what you might the way you interpret reality. All right, so that's all I have.